Greetings, my name is John Mark King. I am the director of the English Language Institute at the American University of Mongolia in Ulaanbaatar. I have been an English teacher, a teacher trainer since 2001. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Uzbekistan, and I have also worked in the United States in academic English programs as an English language fellow in Turkmenistan and the Russian Federation, and also as a teacher in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I've been in Mongolia since the fall of 2011, and I've been at the American University of Mongolia since July of 2012. This recording has been made for the St. Petersburg English Language Teachers Association, with which I have had a close relationship since I was a fellow in St. Petersburg since 2009. And the title of my presentation is Non-Native English-Speaking Teachers and the Native Speaker Fallacy, Challenges and Opportunities. And this is an issue that I had always been familiar with and always had very firmly held points of view on, but not until I became director of a program and was faced with the native speaker fallacy directly from potential and registered students that I began to formulate real understanding of what it means and how we as language professionals can address the issue. So, first things first. A non-native English-speaking teacher, NNEST, or we can call it an NNEST. This is somebody who teaches English, for whom English is not their first language. As opposed to an NEST, or NEST, who is considered a native speaker. Now, the way to find out which one teacher is simply to ask. And teachers self-identify as either an NNEST or a NEST. Now, what is the native speaker fallacy? It's a widely held assumption that native speakers are simply better teachers no matter what their experience or educational background. And so a potential student or member of the public naturally assumes that in order to teach English, you must be a native speaker of English. And that is the first and most important criteria. But differences between non-native English-speaking teachers and native English-speaking teachers. First of all, the educational background is different. Typically speaking, NESTs are educated in either the United States, UK, or Australia, and also have a different educational background before they study English language teaching. This education before studying TESOL principles can be quite striking. For example, your experience as before you became a teacher in high school, in secondary school, and in grade school profoundly affects the way that you approach teaching as a professional in the English language classroom. This is reflected also in differences in teaching practices. While TESOL concepts and foundational principles tend to be universal, every teacher is different, and every teacher approaches the classroom and the English language lesson in a very different way. And the native English-speaking teacher and the non-native English-speaking teacher have the tendency to have different teaching practices, generally speaking. There's also a difference in language proficiency. Generally speaking, native speakers have a higher level of language proficiency. This is not always the case, and of course it's not always the case in every potential content area. But as a general rule, it is true. And also the professional experience. Native speakers who have taught in an ESL environment primarily in the United States or other English-speaking countries have very different professional experience than non-native English-speaking teachers who live and work in an EFL environment. And finally, the cultural background and cultural knowledge between nests and in-nests can be quite different. This, of course, affects what happens in the classroom and how teachers approach their lessons and activities. Now, before we go much farther, there are some questions that I think are important, at least to keep in mind as we complete the presentation. We don't necessarily have to answer them now. But we have to decide, what is a native speaker? When we say the term native speaker, what exactly do we mean? Because it isn't always as easy as it seems to define this term. In the classroom, is one really better than the other? If we have an assumption, if we believe in the native speaker fallacy, for example, is it true? Is one really better? And is it possible that despite this, nests and in-nests might themselves have the tendency to have their own unique strengths that they can bring to the classroom? And do students really have a preference? We may assume that students prefer native speakers, but what does the evidence show? What has the research revealed? And how does the native speaker fallacy affect the way that outsiders perceive our profession? In other words, does this fallacy and allowing it to continue affect how others view our profession? Now, it's important to be very careful. We're making generalizations here between nests and in-nests. And while there may be very clearly definable differences between these two groups, the variety within each group may be even greater. So what's so special about native speakers anyway? I mean, why is there the native speaker fallacy to begin with? I mean, first of all, 80%, most of the world's English teachers are not native speakers. A very, very small percentage, minority, are actually native speakers. Now, perhaps this contributes to the special nature simply because they're so rare. As speaking of speakers of the language, proficient speakers of the language, there are actually more proficient non-native speakers than there are native speakers. So, for the first time in history, a language has more people who learned it as adults or later than people who learned it as native speakers or their mother tongue. This can bring up the argument that, well, perhaps native speakers don't own English exclusively. In addition to this, the broad acceptance of native speaker teachers does not take into account that there are actually a wide variety of native speaker dialects that would be probably inappropriate for teaching. And this needs to be taken into account. However, one thing that native speakers do have, they have experience as users of the language, a lifetime of experience. And in-nests do not have this. Native speakers can be very rich cultural resources. Of course, English is unique in that there is no one English culture, for example, as may exist for other languages. But that doesn't mean that the native speaker can't bring cultural exploration into the classroom. And to go along with their experience as users, native speakers, they tend to have much richer linguistic knowledge, better understanding of nuance and shades of meaning for certain vocabulary words or certain contexts or certain content areas that a non-native speaker may lack. But there are advantages that each group may have, and I want to explore some of them because each group does have certain general tendencies that they bring to the classroom that maybe the other group is not as strong in. And first, let's look at the NNEST advantages. They do have experience as users, as I said before. They do have native speaker intuition, so while a weakness may be that they don't have the same grammatical knowledge, like automatic grammatical knowledge, a native speaker has a tendency to be able to immediately tell if something is not correct or something is maybe a little bit off. If there is a target cultural or historical context, they do have that knowledge. For example, American culture, if the teacher is American. This is particularly useful if the students plan to come to the United States or the students are already in the United States. They have rich textual knowledge, and what I mean by this isn't just text as in written text, but they have knowledge of a variety of context. For example, how to make a telephone call when ordering a pizza, or how to recognize the structure of an essay, or how to write a professional business letter. And they can take advantage of the native speaker fallacy. Right or wrong, it's relatively easy for a native speaker to get a job as a teacher, no matter their experience or education. Now, what about advantages that non-native English-speaking teachers have? You'll see that they're actually quite different than the advantages of native speakers. For one thing, they're a fantastic model of a successful learner for their students. And if the teacher is from the same cultural and linguistic background, they're an even better model. They can show, look, this is actually possible. This is something that a native speaker cannot bring to the classroom with regard to English anyway. They understand the learner's educational background. They have clear knowledge of what kind of experience their students bring to the classroom that they had before they came that a native speaker does not have. They tend to have a much richer grammatical knowledge or understanding of English. Having learned it themselves, they might be able to explain and present new grammatical forms in a way that's easier for their students to understand and acquire. They also can anticipate the difficulties, especially if they share the native language of their student. They know what kinds of problems speakers of that language may tend to have with English structures and contexts. In addition, one great advantage is that there's less distance between the teacher and the student, and in other words, cultural closeness, and also very often the native speaker is placed on a pedestal, someone that you have difficulty approaching perhaps, or difficulty asking questions of, or maybe you feel nervous speaking around a native speaker. If you can eliminate that or lessen it by having a non-native English-speaking teacher in the classroom. And they share the learner's first language. This contributes also to closeness and anticipation of difficulties, as was discussed before. Now, challenges each group might have. First of all, challenges for the native speaker. Native speakers struggle with the expectation that simply because they are experienced users of English, that automatically translates to skills as a teacher. I've experienced this myself, and it's rather difficult to deal with because simply knowing a language does not mean you can teach it. Very often, English teachers who are native speakers have little to no experience as language learners. Now, very often this is not the case. That English teachers or native speakers have studied other languages in the past, but certainly they don't have experience studying English as a second language. If they're teaching in an EFL environment, they can be they face challenges as cultural outsiders. This works especially in an institution that might have its own set of expectations for behavior and rules for teaching and communicating with students and the administration that you're not familiar with. And what these difficulties often lead to is greater status for the native speaker as a curiosity rather than as a respected member of faculty. And so this might result in a native speaker being placed in a classroom but not really being fully taken advantage of, and is only there so the administration can say, oh yes, we have native speaker teachers. Now, what about challenges for the NNEST? Well, generally speaking, there's often a perceived inferiority that they have to native speakers, no matter their background, no matter their experience. This automatic preference for native speakers can be very difficult for the non-native English-speaking teacher to deal with, especially when it comes to hiring and pay practices. Non-native English-speaking teachers struggle with errors and mistakes, and they often worry that their students are going to hear their errors, or that their native speaker colleagues are going to hear them and judge them based on it. This leads to reticence in the classroom, and also can lead to greater difficulty in trying out new approaches in their lessons and activities. They can often fear student questions about grammar, questions about culture especially, or questions about context and content that a non-native English speaking teacher may not have. Just like worry over errors, this can lead to a greater reliance on the teacher-centered classroom, where the teacher controls all the knowledge and the students simply receive it, rather than a student-centered approach where there's much more freedom of movement of information. Students are encouraged to explore and ask questions. Non-native English-speaking teachers generally are not automatically accepted by students. What tends to happen is that a student might hear, oh, my teacher is not a native speaker. Even though I don't know her, I automatically assume that I know what kind of teacher she's going to be, simply because of what other people say or because of my own experience in other classrooms. And very often, especially in the developing world, non-native English-speaking teachers lack the tools and often the educational background to make the principles that we know work that are related to communicative language teaching more locally relevant and important for their learners. And as a result, or as related to that, they have little experience with the fundamentals of communicative language teaching, which itself in the West is a relatively new concept anyway. But very often non-native English-speaking teachers are still struggling with an institutional or a cultural acceptance of traditional approaches to language teaching, such as grammar translation. And this approach is reflected in students' perception of the quality of non-native English-speaking teachers over native speakers who come to the classroom with different tools, different approaches. But let's talk about student preference. What do they really prefer? Well, generally speaking, preference for native speakers, or the existence of the native speaker fallacy, is often without personal experience with a good in-nest, or is taken from negative experience with an in-nest and is applied to future expectation. So, for example, a student may say, well, all of my previous Russian English teachers were like this, so naturally I expect my new Russian English teacher to be just like the others. Or, everyone says that native speakers are better, so it must be true. And people stop there. They make that assumption, and they stick with it. However, evidence has shown, research has shown, that a quality teacher who's a non-native speaker, who's conscientious, who works hard, who cares about her students, does a very good job of winning over their students. In other words, students show a preference for qualified non-native speakers, often over native speakers, especially after they see them in action. So, the native speaker fallacy in ELT. What is this doing to our profession? We can, if we take the native speaker fallacy and try and analyze it for what effect it has on our profession as a whole, we can say that it leads to lower salaries for everyone. And this happens because native speakers tend to be preferred, no matter what their background. And so administrations and schools and institutes can justify paying a native speaker a low salary simply because they don't have the educational background or may not have the same educational background. Yet this person is considered special. And so even though this person, this native speaker, makes a low salary, this salary is generally considered to be the highest. And so everyone else makes a even lower salary. So basically it lowers the bar for the potential salaries that an English teacher can make. Because also there's a tendency to prefer the native speaker over the professional, the profession as a whole, TESOL as a whole, loses respect. The general acceptance of the native speaker over the professional and conscientious, hardworking teacher, no matter what the native language, leads to lack of respect. The native speaker fallacy also leads to low teacher confidence, especially non-native English-speaking teachers who work hard, who are conscientious, who care about their students, Yet, despite this, there is a consistent tendency to prefer native speakers. This can certainly affect any teacher's confidence. And it also leads to lower expectations across the board. If the top teacher can be a non-professional, then expectations are lowered for everybody. And it leads to poor learner confidence. If our teachers in the classroom are not professional, they're not using proven instructional techniques, they don't know the principles of language learning and language acquisition, they don't know things about critical thinking, the value of group work, when and how to correct or address student errors, then student learning drops and student confidence drops. So as professionals, what can we do? Well, if I'm a native English speaking teacher, I can support and respect my colleagues who are not native speakers, both in the classroom and out of the classroom. When you encounter the native speaker fallacy, be ready to address it. When you encounter issues that non-native speaking English teachers are having with regard to their confidence, show that you support them and remind them of the strengths that they have. This support can manifest as collaboration on projects, writing articles, co-presentations, team teaching together. Any way that you can bring native speakers and non-native speakers together can only strengthen the connection and also lead to greater teaching across the board and greater confidence amongst non-native English-speaking teachers. What can the NNEST do? Continue to improve your skills in English. Never stop learning. And that's really important, I think. Once you become a teacher, it does not mean you can stop improving your own skills. Continue to be that model of a successful learner for your learners. Make sure you're active in your local association. Stay up to date with TESOL publications and new trends in the field. Very often non-native English-speaking teachers are behind native speakers with regard to the most up-to-date or the most recent literature. You can very easily stay up to date by being active in your association and reading up on what's new in the TESOL world. Take advantage of the strengths that you have in the classroom. Make your students aware of them. You do have strength if you're a non-native English-speaking teacher. And if you know them, you can better take advantage of them. And you can also more effectively make sure your students are aware of them as well. And be prepared when students and parents bring up the native speaker fallacy. Be ready to address it. Know how to explain what strengths the non-native English-speaking teacher has. And be honest about the challenges that you face. I mean, it's one thing to assume that native English-speaking teachers are better or that they have certain strengths. But if you, as a non-native speaker, acknowledge the challenges that you face with regard to teaching practices, with regard to student expectations, with regard to your own skills in English, you can better address them in the future. And that's it. This is my email address. If you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to write me. And also my references.